And shalom and greetings, saints of the Most High, Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, our Elohim. I'm Rod Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. I want to thank you so much for taking the time from your busy schedules to fellowship with me here today. And as always, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. As I am recording and posting this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer, we are just 18 days away from Shavuot, otherwise known as Pentecost. This being day 32 of what is traditionally referred to as the counting of the Omer. So take note that Shavuot, Pentecost, will fall on Sunday, May 31st of this year. And as we get closer to the time, I'll post a teaching on this high holy day. Now, this program is hosted on our website, www.themessianictorahobserver.org. Again, www.themessianictorahobserver.org. Our sister site is www.itsnotasYouperceive.com. Check out both of those websites. There you'll find the social media platforms we utilize, the various methods you can use to communicate with us, as well as the platforms by which you can support this ministry with your financial gifts. So subscribe, follow, support this ministry as the Spirit leads. So I want to thank you in advance, beloved. And without further ado, let's get right into today's discussion entitled The Book of Romans. To whom was the book written? This will be part 16 of our Paul and Hebrew Roots series. In this installment of our Paul and Hebrew Roots series, we seek to identify Shaul's, the Apostle Paul's original intended audience for this letter to the Romans. Now, I told you in the previous installments, as well as in the first few installments of this series, that it was important to establish right off the bat to whom the individual books of the Bible were originally addressed. And it would stand to reason that many of us find Shaul's writings difficult to understand, in part because we do not fully understand to whom his letters were written. So then, a present-day reader who reads Shaul's epistles without establishing the letter's original intended audience stands to misinterpret and or misunderstand some of the letter's content. And I'll embellish upon what I mean by that in just a few moments. Before we venture out and start tackling some of those challenging and important passages of Romans, we want to first understand who Shaul's original intended audience was for this letter. Now, why is this so important? Well, knowing who Shaul's, the Apostle Paul's original intended audience was, helps us determine what content in the Sefer, that is the letter, the epistle, pertains specifically to Shaul's original intended readers. In this case, the intended readers being the Roman Kahila, otherwise known as the Roman Church, as well as what content pertained to all the Kahilas, all the so-called churches the apostle oversaw. And this is equally important to our understanding of what specific content contained in the Sefer, in the letter to the Romans, is and is not applicable to Messianics today. Because at the end of the day, isn't this primarily what we're after? The specific content contained in the book of Romans that apply to us today? That's really what we're after. You see, as we made mention back in our earlier installments to this series, Some things Shaul wrote about were organizational and personal in nature, and it did not apply to any persons or organizations outside that original addressees to his letter. An example of this is clearly seen in Shaul's letter to the Corinthian Messianic assemblies, instructing them, "Let your women keep silence in the churches. For it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." And that was 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34, the King James Version rendering. For those of you who listened to my post addressing this passage, you may recall that we found this Pauline instruction was meant only for the Corinthian Messianic assemblies at the specific time the apostle wrote it. Now, this instruction was not originally intended to be followed by the other kahilas, the other churches, the other assemblies that Shaul oversaw. While other things Paul wrote were evergreen in nature, when I mean evergreen, that means universal application. That means it never has a time limit on it. It's just there for all to use and understand. Wide-ranging application without a time limit on it. These other things that Paul wrote that were evergreen in nature and in content had universal application both in scope of region and time, such as Shaul's instruction to the same Corinthian Messianics, the same ones, to, quote, keep the feast, not with old leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And that was 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8. Instructions such as the one related to the Corinthian women were intended to address a specific issue or situation within the original intended reader's kahila. Now, while other things Shaul wrote were evergreen in nature and content and had universal application both in scope of region and time, such as Shaul's instruction to the same Corinthian Messianics to keep the feast, not with old leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8. Instructions such as the one related to the Corinthian women or woman were intended to address a specific issue or situation within the original intended reader's kahila or assemblies. Again, for those of you who are familiar with previous installments of this series, you may recall I introduced you to the internal consistency concept. Internal consistency concept. Within that concept, the Berean-styled student of Scripture is compelled to determine what passages of Scripture are normative, and what passage of Scripture are restrictive. So just to reiterate, normative passages tend to consist of universal, evergreen content that every true disciple of Yeshua should heed and apply to their respective walks with Mashiach, with Messiah. Conversely, restrictive passages tend to consist of regional, original addressee specific content that may not apply to any of the other assemblies Shaul oversaw, or for that matter, would not apply to Messianics today. Again, we have the example of the restriction Shaul placed against women speaking in the Corinthian kahilas. Clearly, those restrictions did not apply to the other kahilas Shaul oversaw at the time, nor does this restriction apply in most cases to us today. Some may ask, are restrictive passages then of any significance to present-day disciples of Mashiach? Absolutely. For just as we find certain Torah commandments do not apply to Messianics today, those same non-applicable commandments may have important spiritual applications attached to them that Messianics today should give careful consideration to in their walk with Mashiach. So let me ask you to step back for just a second to the example of Shaul instructing that the Corinthian women or women be silent in the assemblies. Now, if a similar situation of a troublemaking woman, and or man for that matter, wreaking chaos and havoc were to exist in one's kahila, then this instruction would certainly apply to this situation even today. You see what I'm trying to say? As we progress in our study of Romans, I want you to keep in mind that we will be looking at the epistle's content from a multi-layered cultural, Hebraic, historic, geographical perspective. I know that's a mouthful, but we're going to be looking at these challenging and difficult and exciting Pauline passages from a number of perspectives in order to come to the most accurate and the most meaningful translation, interpretation, understanding of the passage that we possibly can. So we're going to be looking at things from a cultural, Hebraic, historic, geographical perspective. Thus, in preparation for this study, I've tapped a few of the best Messianic teachers around to help fill in the gaps where my understanding and knowledge may be lacking. So let's attempt to answer our focus question. Who was the original intended audience for the book, the Sefer, the letter, the epistle, the scroll to the Romans? Would it surprise you to know that Paul did not found the church at Rome? Most people believe that he did. But Paul was not the founder of the Roman church or the Roman kahila. In fact, Shaul himself made note that he had been hindered getting to Rome and he desperately desired to visit their kahila. And this is in chapter 1 of Romans, verses 11, 13, and 15. And Shaul writes, "For I long to see you, so that I might share with you some spiritual gift that can make you stronger. I want you to know that although I have been prevented from visiting you until now, I have often planned to do so, in order that I might have some fruit among you. Therefore, I am eager to proclaim the good news also to you who live in Rome." And that, my friends, was the complete Jewish Bible rendering. Therefore, Shaul was indeed making plans to visit his readers in Rome. However, it appears from Shaul's own words in this epistle, as well as from the historical accounting of Shaul's third missionary journey in the book of Acts, that prior to making the trip to Rome, Shaul had pressing charitable matters to take care of. So it was that at the time Shaul was penning this letter to the Roman kahila, his work in Corinth was drawing to a close. And this can be found in Romans chapter 15, verses 23 to 28. So he was preparing to journey to Jerusalem to deliver donations for the poor that he had collected from Achaean and Macedonian brethren. And again, this is recorded in Acts chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, as well as Acts chapter 24, verse 17. So who then founded the Roman kahila if Paul didn't? Who founded the Roman kahila? It is firmly established by most knowledgeable Bible students and scholars that the church, that is the kahila in Hebrew, the ecclesia in Greek, was established by Roman Jews who were eyewitnesses to the great outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh on Shavuot, Acts chapter 2, 10 days after Yeshua ascended to heaven. It's recorded in Acts chapter 2, verse 5 through 11. And the complete Jewish Bible rendering reads as such. Now there were staying in Jerusalem religious Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, that is the sound of a mighty rushing wind, a crowd gathered. They were confused, because each one heard the believers speaking in his own language. Totally amazed, they asked, "How is this possible? Aren't all these people who are speaking from the Galilee? How is it that we hear them speaking in our native languages? We are visitors from Rome." And there's a litany of other places throughout the Roman Empire that are listed, but I jumped a little bit and just listed that these are visitors from Rome because we're talking about the book to the Romans. But Luke records them saying, "We are visitors from many, many places, but here, in this instance, from Rome, Jews by birth and proselytes. How is it that we hear them speaking in our own languages about the great things God has done?" Again, that was Acts chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. These supposed founders of the kahila of the Romans would have been members of the 3,000 converted Shavuot or Pentecost attendees from that day. And upon returning to Rome after their historic encounter with the Spirit of Yahweh, Yahuwah, their life-changing testimony launched the birth of the Roman kahila. Tied to this, however, it becomes imperative that we remember a couple things in regard to the start of the kahila in Rome. 1. A kahila is Hebrew for congregation or church. With the negative connotation that accompanies the term church, as I said at the beginning, I will attempt to replace the term church with kahila in our post whenever practical and sensible. And for those of you who don't know the sort of controversy around the term church, well, the term church as used in the Latin, let's just say, was circe, which through transliterations and different renderings, it comes out as church. And I'm not an expert at this, mind you, but this is my understanding that the term was used in a derogatory manner to describe the gathering of the set-apart believers in Yeshua Messiah. So the term actually refers to a circus. So the secular Romans who were on the outside looking in, judging these set-apart ones, the saints in Rome, the Messianics, saw their behavior, saw their worship as a circus. So the term, though it is not bad per se, it carries with it that negative connotation that the Latin or the Greek, let's just say, brings with it. So it's best that we defer to the Hebrew, which is kahila, or if you prefer, the Greek or of ecclesia. Okay? I just wanted to bring that out because when we hear in Hebrew roots in the Messianic faith, the Notsari community, you'll often hear, or you'll often see us bristle up when we hear the term church. And, it's interesting because when Hillary and I began this ministry going on 10 years ago, plus years ago, it's been a while now, we named our ministry Qumran Family Church. And that's before we understood that the term church had negative connotations. We have not taken action to change that, but we're looking at doing so in the future. So we don't normally emphasize, but being transparent, we don't normally emphasize that this ministry, this podcast, is a ministry of Qumran Family Church because of the negative connotation that the term church has with it. But we're not ashamed of it either. We're not trying to hide it. It's right there in plain sight for people to see if they are interested. But I just wanted you to know, especially for those of you who are new to faith, that the term church does have in our faith community some negative connotations attached to it. It's not that it's a bad thing. It's just that it was used negatively by the world looking from the outside in regards to the brethren, our forefathers in the faith. Continuing on, the other thing to bear in mind regarding kahilas, and this is, of course, applies to the standard English term church, is that it can describe a brick and mortar building where like-minded brethren meet to worship. When you hear the term church, you look and you see there's a building with a steeple, with a spire. That's the traditional Greek type church. It's a brick and mortar building. It can also describe kahila, church, assembly, can also describe the physical gathering of like-minded brethren for worship or other spiritual activities. Consequently, kahila can describe the ideological spiritual body of set-apart souls who belong to Mashiach, to Messiah, and the family of Jehovah our Elohim. Second point, the Roman kahila, the Roman assembly, speaking about the ideological spiritual body, would not have existed absent the local Roman Jewish synagogues. How so? Well, those Shavuot, those Pentecost converts, were diaspora Jews and Jewish proselytes. Recall the Acts chapter 2 passage. We are visitors from Rome. We're Jews by birth and proselytes. So these were diaspora Jews and Jewish proselytes. These would have returned to their home synagogues in Rome and worshiped as they had done before their conversion. However, beyond the structured cookie-cutter worship and learning that defined first century Common Era Jewish synagogues, the Messianic members of those synagogues would have extended their New Covenant Spirit Truth worship, if practical, and I stress if practical, in either their local synagogues or in certain key members' homes, that being home fellowships or assemblies. What do I mean by if practical? Well, depending on the predominant leaning of that synagogue, such that that synagogue, if it had predominantly more Orthodox Jewish members, then it would probably be difficult to have the New Covenant Spirit Truth worship take place there overriding the Orthodox teachings and activity in comparison to whether if the New Covenant Spirit truth worshipers outnumbered the Orthodox. So it just depends who was in charge, who had the predominant number would determine whether or not that Spirit truth New Covenant worship could be practiced in that synagogue. As well as I mentioned that there would be an extension to home fellowships and assemblies. In other words, there were no Roman standalone, my point in making this, I should say, there were no Roman standalone brick and mortar Nazarene or Christian kahilas, churches, or congregations to speak of. It just wasn't there. Remember at the beginning of this, I told you my concept, my Greek-minded, Western-minded, Greek lens understanding of when I open the book and I see the book to the Romans, that I'm thinking of a big old mega church in the middle, right down the street from the Colosseum. No, that's not the way it was. It was completely different. It probably was synagogue based. And we're going to get a little more into this because this is extremely important in our determining who the original intended audience to this epistle was. And we will find out that this is vitally important information to keep in the back of our heads. Because these ideological, spirit-based kahilas, if you will, would have been contained within the synagogues that were strewn throughout Rome. So the synagogal system played a crucial role in the life, in the community, if you will, of Messianics in Rome in the first century. Since Rome was this regional first century melting pot, there's no doubt that the Roman kahila consisted of a great many Gentile converts. This is not just because it makes geographical sense, mind you. There is obviously an invested interest on Shaul's part to explain to certain Gentile members of the Roman kahila their set-apart status in relation to their Jewish counterparts. And I'm referring to the 9th through the 11th chapters of the book of Romans. And interestingly enough, it would seem that despite Shaul not being the original founder of the Roman kahila, as we spoke of earlier, he was close friends with a number of the kahila's Gentile members, as evidenced by his personal greetings to them in chapter 16. Now, many of the names mentioned in this greeting list were Jew, but several, like Gaius, Erastus, and Phoebe, were Gentiles. And Shaul himself asserts in his writings that he came to know and love these and other Gentile converts, turned teachers, turned preachers, turned leaders of the faith at some points during his 3 missionary journeys. Despite the apostle not being the founder of the Roman kahila, we must consider that the individuals Shaul sends his greetings to in chapter 16 of this book were influential in the overall spiritual growth of the Roman kahilas. How so? Well, many of those listed in Shaul's greeting list were leaders of the kahila. And these accomplished men and women of the gospel were originally discipled and mentored by Shaul. These in turn taught, these in turn admonished, and these in turn helped grow the Roman kahila over several years. So, in a sense, one could say that Shaul oversaw the Roman kahila despite not being its original founder. J.K. McKee, a prolific Messianic apologist, contends that Roman Messianics were dispersed among the number of home congregations or fellowships. Indeed, Shaul never describes his readers as being a church. He didn't describe them as a kahila or an ecclesia. Or rather, Shaul did not address his audience as the church in Rome. Indeed, it is clear that given the sheer number of Messianics in Rome, it was not possible for the whole congregation to meet in any one place. Thus, we can conclude that there was no single group of Messianics in Rome. According to James R. Edwards, New Testament scholar and professor of theology at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington, he writes, quote, "It is clear that Romans is addressed to a predominantly Gentile congregation, the one in which a significant Jewish element was present." Now, I personally believe there's some truth to both McKee's and Edwards' assertions about the Roman kahila, but I believe their assertions are weak. Their assertions are anemic in describing the true nature and makeup of the Roman kahila. So I turn to Tim Haig, a prolific author and president of the Torah Research Institute, who places a tremendous amount of trust in the established synagogal system being the platform by which Roman Messianic worship and teaching primarily took place. And Haig, in his commentary on the book of Romans, cites James D. Dunn, a New Testament scholar at the University of Durham in England, quote, "To be able to assume such a knowledge of the scriptures as Paul does in Romans, he would have to assume that his readership by and large had enjoyed a substantial link with the synagogues in Rome," end quote. Now, Haig goes on to postulate in his commentary that Shaul was writing to a synagogue community in Rome that was part of a larger Jewish community. Indeed, the set-apart faith, known as the Way, known as the Nazarenes, Notsari, at the time this epistle was written, was considered a Jewish sect. Thus, it would seem reasonable to conclude that the assembly in Rome to whom this epistle was written identified themselves as members of the Jewish or synagogal community. Now, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of at least 11 synagogue structures in Rome that would have been in operation about the time Shaul wrote this epistle. These structures would have accommodated at least 20 or as many as 40 faithfuls. Haig, however, estimates that Rome was home to some 20,000 to 50,000 Jews at the time Shaul composed this epistle. That being said, it stands to reason that there had to be more than 11 synagogues in Rome at that time. I tend to side with Mr. Haig in his assessment that the Roman kahila was primarily synagogue-based, and that Shaul's original intended readers were members of the Nazarene Jewish sect. And we know from the Jerusalem Council, as recorded in Acts chapter 15, that James the Just, upon hearing Shaul's report that many Gentiles throughout the Roman Empire were coming to faith, evidenced by their glossolalia, their speaking in tongues, sent forth an edict to all the Messianic assemblies that the Gentiles continue in their faith by making use of the locally established synagogal system for their training and learning of Torah. This, my friends, is critical information to tuck away in our minds and hearts. For contrary to fundamental charismatic Orthodox conventional wisdom, the so-called Roman Church, of which this epistle was addressed, let's just say, was not a Sunday keeping, was not a Torah rejecting, was not a Jewish Hebrew hating, was not a Jesus, a Greek Messiah worshiping launching pad for the Roman Catholic Church, as so many have postulated in their writings and teachings and preachings and so forth. Far from it, actually. In fact, Roman Catholicism, ergo Greek-based Christianity, ultimately overran and hijacked Shaul's Roman kahila, let's just say, subjecting the true faith once delivered to near extinction in the 4th century of the Common Era. So let us not fall for the false teaching and thinking that the original intended recipients of this epistle were anything other than the real deal. Essentially, Nazarenes, Notsari, Messianics who practiced Judaism but embraced Yeshua as Mashiach, as Messiah. Yes, 1st century Common Era Palestinian Rabbinic Judaism had become corrupted. We know that. Yeshua railed against the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees. And they, of course, were instrumental in having him crucified because he pushed back against the traditions of the elders. As well as this is what Shaul was trying to work through with the Roman kahila in his letter, this corrupted rabbinic Judaism. But we cannot think the Roman kahila was anything other than a true Messianic sect of Judaism. Plain and simple. From a historic perspective, we know that Roman Emperor Claudius ejected the Jews from Rome. Now, this ejection was recorded in a literary work by Suetonius in 49 of the Common Era. And that work was entitled The Edict of Claudius. According to Suetonius, Claudius expelled the Jewish population, no doubt both Orthodox and Messianic Jew, from his city, quote, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, end quote. And Chrestus, my friends, as used here by Suetonius, is a reference to Christ. And most scholars believe that Claudius's expulsion order was in response to disturbances between Rome's Jewish population and members of the city's growing Messianic community. And it is clear, well, I should say it is unclear precisely what those issues were, but it would appear that the Messianic movement taking place in Rome at the time the expulsion order was enacted was a convenient excuse for Claudius to persecute and get rid of the city's Jewish population. Now, it should be noted that Claudius's edict expelled both Orthodox and Messianic Jew alike. And I've come across various writings in my study that give a 5 to 10 year duration for that Jewish expulsion. And history bears out that Claudius's expulsion order was reversed by Emperor Nero sometime early in Nero's rule. Now, Claudius's Jewish expulsion was noted by Luke in relation to Shaul's close partners in ministry, Aquila and Priscilla. This in Acts chapter 18, verse 2. And Luke writes, and when Paul, Shaul, departed from Athens, he went to Corinth. And he found there a Jewish man from the region of Pontus, whose name was Aquila. And Aquila had just then arrived from the country of Italy, with his wife Priscilla because Claudius Caesar had commanded that all Jews should depart from Rome. And that was the Aramaic English New Testament rendering. It is clear that less than a decade or so after Shaul's evangelistic work with Priscilla and Aquila had taken place in Corinth, Aquila and Priscilla returned to their former home in Rome. And this is documented in Romans chapter 16, verse 3. Given the brief number of years the Jewish community was absent from Rome, it would be safe to presume that the Gentile converts to the faith would have completely taken over the Roman kahila, just by sheer numbers alone. Thus, upon the expelled Messianic Jews' return to Rome and their synagogues, well, they would have found themselves in the minority. This, of course, presumes that not all of the expelled Jews, be they Orthodox or Messianic alike, returned to Rome. Nevertheless, Claudius's edict was reversed upon the emperor's death in 54 of the Common Era. And it is reasonable to conclude that the returning exiled Jews experienced some repatriation problems. It's conceivable that the returning Messianic Jews, no doubt in the extreme minority at the time, probably expected things in their former assemblies to return back to the way they were prior to their expulsion. And it would not be a stretch to think there existed instances of Gentile resentment towards their returning Jewish brethren. And of course, in those 5 to 10 years of Jewish exile, well, new Gentile converts would establish themselves in the Roman kahila. And these new faces would not be familiar to the returning Messianic Jews, who would no doubt want to resume their leadership roles in the faith community. So these relationship variables, for lack of a better descriptor, no doubt incited some of the issues and problems that erupted in the repatriation of Rome's Messianic Nazarene Jews. And some of these issues Paul writes about in this epistle. So it's a very interesting situation that developed here in Rome, in the Roman kahila. And this is, again, why it's so important to know who the letter was originally addressed to and what their situation was, what it was like. Because with this information that I give you, although it may seem dry to you, although it may seem a bit much to have to really take in order to understand the more challenging and difficult passages of Paul, it's really important, because at the heart of the situation taking place in Rome, with all these variables, with all of the expulsions, with the mixed congregations, repatriation, expulsions, everything plays into what Paul was trying to address and convey to his intended original audience. That's how we understand some of Paul's challenging and difficult passages, is really drilling down to see who he was addressing and what their situation on the ground was like. So we've established up to this point that the original intended audience for the Sefer of the Romans, or the Sefer to the Romans, were Nazarene or Notsari or Messianic biological Jews and Gentiles, as well as, I forgot to add, proselyte Jews, Jews who converted to Judaism, and they ultimately, Gentiles who converted to Judaism, I should say, and some of these also converted to the true faith once delivered as well. So you got a mismatch, a mashup, if you will, of different situations here in Rome. And this is fascinating to me. This melting pot known as the Roman kahila. Now, this mashup, these participated in Jewish worship, and they received Torah instruction through the synagogal system, as well as many extended their worship and learning over into home fellowships, as McKee alluded to in his commentary. So this is not a clean one-size-fits-all situation here on the ground in first century Common Era Rome. It just isn't. There was a lot of variables in play here. Again, it's so important to know who Paul was writing to. But the Roman kahila members, these held to the true faith that was delivered to them by the original witnesses to the Shavuot, the Pentecost event in Jerusalem about 3 decades prior, as recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 2, as well as they received teachings from the large cast of teachers and preachers of the gospel that either visited or even lived among them. Remember that list of the greeting list that Shaul had in chapter 16 of this book? After Shaul's 5 verses of introduction in the first chapter of this sefer, he proceeds to identify his intended audience, this Roman kahila, from 3 fascinating perspectives. Number 1, he refers to them as called to obedience of the faith in Yeshua's name among the Gentile nations of the world. Verses 5 and 6. And this is how the New King James Version renders it. Obedience of the faith in Yeshua's name among the Gentile nations. I know that's a mouthful. Stern's Complete Jewish Bible renders this identity related to obedience of the faith as the Romans kahila is called to promote, quote, trust grounded obedience among the Gentiles, end quote. Trust grounded obedience among the Gentiles. What are we talking about here? It would seem reasonable to conclude that although Shaul claims this obedience of the faith in Yeshua's name was incumbent upon him as an apostle, the Roman kahila was also required to be obedient to the faith, as we all are today. Some Messianic scholars reference the apostolic halakha. The apostolic halakha, that is the actual obedient walking out of the faith that was enjoined upon Gentile converts to the faith by the Apostolic Jerusalem Council, as recorded in Acts chapter 15. Thus, under the auspices of the Jerusalem Council's apostolic halakha, converted Gentiles would be admitted to the Jewish community, and in this case, the Roman Jewish community, once the convert entirely abandoned their former paganistic ways and entirely embraced the purity laws of Israel, which generally revolved around the issue of sexual and food impurities. In other words, the Gentile convert embraced and walked out Torah in their lives. This was the end result and purpose behind the Jerusalem Council edict that James sent to the kahilas in the Roman Empire. Thus, Gentiles became engrafted, full-fledged members of the Hebrew Jewish community upon fully embracing and obeying the faith's apostolic halakha. This apostolic halakha is the obedience to the faith in Yeshua's name that Shaul was attributing to the Roman kahila. As it related to the converted Gentiles, they would be expected to have entirely given up their former pagan ways for the true faith that was delivered to them. And this obedience to faith that Shaul writes about is directly tied to Yah's requirements for righteous living on the part of the convert who has entirely abandoned their former paganistic ways. The second title that Shaul renders to the Roman kahila. The members of the Roman kahila were considered beloved of Yehovah. Beloved of Yehovah. Verse 7. In the Greek, beloved of God is agapetoi theou. Agapetoi theou. The agapetoi denotes someone who is dear to someone. In this case, that someone is Yehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah. And at a human level, this term often references children and fellow Christians, fellow believers. From a spiritual perspective, the term is applied to a special choice or selection of the Most High. Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. According to the Freiburg lexicon, beloved of God refers to one who is not only greatly loved, but is also unique, the only one of a class. According to the Louw-Nida lexicon, the beloved of God is one who is loved, the object of one's affection, one who is loved, one who is dear. According to the LSI lexicon, beloved of God can refer to an only son. Thayer's Greek lexicon defines beloved of God as applied to Christians being reconciled to God and judged by him to be worthy of eternal life. And according to Gingrich lexicon, the beloved of God term is applied to the Messiah with connotation of special choice by God. Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. Now, Tim Hegg builds upon this lexiconal definition by describing the phrase, those who are chosen by Yehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, quote, to receive his grace, end quote. And then Hegg goes on to remind us that Father referred to Israel using this phrasing, despite the nation's rejection of Yeshua as their Mashiach, as their Messiah. Romans chapter 11, verse 28. Thus, when we're talking about Israel from the standpoint of being God's beloved, we're really talking about a group of individuals who have been designated or elected for the Father's sovereign purpose and will. Hegg further notes that the focus of the phrase beloved of Yah is that of Yah's love for his elect, as opposed to the Roman kahila's love for Yehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah. And it is clear that Yah's love for his chosen ones always precedes the elect's love for Yah. For the Apostle John affirms for us that Yah loved us before we could possibly love him. Oh, hallelujah. 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. Agapetoi is found 3 times in the Septuagint. Genesis chapter 22, verses 2 and verse 12, and verse 26, related to the binding of Isaac, of Yitzhak, by Abraham, Isaac being bound by his dad, Abraham. Indeed, we see here the prophetic shadow picture of Yehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, offering up his beloved son for the sins of the world. Interestingly enough, David refers to himself as Yah's beloved in the Septuagint. Psalm chapter 60, verse 5, Psalm chapter 108, verse 6, and Psalm 127, verse 2. These speak of a familial relationship between Yah and David. That is, Yah being David's father, loving his son David, his chosen king over his chosen beloved people, Yisrael. But we find most prominently featured in the Bat Coals of the Brit Hadashah, the pronouncements by our Heavenly Father regarding his son, Yeshua HaMashiach, referring to Yehoshua, our Messiah, as his beloved son, as my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, and Matthew chapter 17, verse 5. And the third title that Shaul gives to the Roman Kahila is that of saints. Saints. Shaul refers to the members of the Roman Kahila as saints. Now, the term or title saints is the same as holy in the Greek agios, which means to be marked off, to be separate, to be withdrawn from common use. When we talk about, or when we reference this concept of a certain group of individuals who are designated as holy, we are talking about a group of individuals who have a relationship with the Almighty that is special, that is unlike any in the world. When we meditate on what it means to be holy or to be a saint, we are essentially meditating on the holiness of Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah. And that holiness is an absolute attribute that is specific to Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, the creator of the universe. And Yah requires his people, his elect, his chosen ones, possess and demonstrate this very same attribute of holiness. Now, from a broader perspective, we're talking about a relationship here. In order to maintain a true relationship with the creator of the universe, one must become and remain holy. You see, when we come to faith, Yah imputes his holiness to us. Thus, we stand before Yah justified, righteous, and holy. Yeshua's blood covers us from all unrighteousness. So we stand before Yah justified, righteous, and holy. And the would-be saint is given clean and white spiritual garments. However, it is incumbent upon the would-be saint to maintain, to keep, and to walk out a life of righteousness and holiness. Thus, the would-be saint is required to keep their white garments clean and crisp if he or she desires to please their creator and to enter his kingdom. This requirement and the existence of this attribute in the life of a notzari, of a set-apart disciple of Yeshua, is indicative of Yah's absolute authority. In other words, Yah is saying to us, I am this way. I am holy. You must be the same way. You must be holy. You see, it's going to be my way or it's going to be my way. Which way are you going to choose? So when holiness was applied to Yisrael, it was to be understood by all creation that Yisrael was Yah's special people. And I would refer you to Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 2, Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 18, Psalm chapter 135, verse 4, and Titus chapter 2, verse 14. As it is carried over onto the intended reader of Paul's or Shaul's letter to the Romans, Shaul is writing to those who have been called by the holy God, Yahweh. Now, these individuals are thus holy by virtue of that calling that Father puts forth, that separation of the Kahila, the members of the Kahila, from the rest of the nation peoples of the world. These individuals are holy by virtue of what that calling means. They are parceled away. Consequently, given that our God is a God of the free will, it thus falls upon the called out ones to maintain and walk out, that is halakha, holy and righteous lives, thus earning the title of saints, maintaining the title of saints. We're not talking about earning one's salvation here. When we're talking about sainthood, we're talking about walking and talking and living out the part of being a saint. It's one thing to be called a saint. It's another thing to walk it out. So this is where we'll stop for today, and I trust that you got something from this teaching, at least as much as I got out of putting it together for you. I left out so much content. Oh my gosh. It just boggles the mind how much content I've put together just for this specific installment that I didn't use because it would be time prohibitive. But I would ask you, in anticipation of our next installment to this series, to meditate on the identities of the original intended audience for this book to the Romans. I would ask you to think about the connection that the Roman Kahila had with the Hebrew or Jewish faith at the time this letter was written. I would ask you to consider what obedience to the faith meant to Shaul, what obedience to the faith meant to the Roman Kahila, and what obedience to the faith in the name of Yeshua means to you. Meditate on what it means to be beloved of Yahweh, Yahuwah, as well as what it means to be a saint. And when we return with the next installment to this series, we will actually begin looking at those interesting and challenging Pauline passages in the Sefer, the letter, the epistle, the book to the Roman Kahila. So until next time, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shalom. Take care.